Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you here to the Wolfson, BIAA Wolfson conference room. I would like to stress once again that it's not because we think that it's fashionable to have such a nicely named conference room. It's due to the fact that the Wolfson paid for it. So, it's a pleasure, like I say, to introduce Michele. Michele has a long-standing tradition with BIAA. He came the first time in 2009 and basically didn't leave anymore. I mean, or he left but came back, and we are very happy about that. In 2010, we granted him his first study grant. Afterwards, he was BIAA research assistant and BIAA research scholar. So, and in between, he did lots of other things, which I'm going to briefly tell you about. So, he did his BA in the Near Eastern Archaeology at Università di Roma La Sapienza, and then moved to the UK, where he did his Master in Science degree in GIS and Spatial Analysis in Archaeology at University College of London. His PhD degree, also from UCL, it took him a while to get the PhD degree. I don't say this to downgrade him, because he did it as a part-time student. And in between, I'm going to read you all the, not all, but several of the scholarships and fellowships he had, and you will see that he has been doing quite a lot of different things. He had a Marie Curie Award, an Arts and Humanities Research Council Scholarship, a Roma La Sapienza University Scholarship to support postgraduate study abroad, Socrates Exchange at ODTÜ, Koç University Anamet Junior Fellowship, and TÜBİTAK Fellowship in 2016. Since 2016, then, immediately afterwards, he was assistant professor in Bilecik Şehit Edebali University in Turkey, and since this academic year, he is honorary fellow at the British Institute again. Like I said, it took him a while to finish his PhD, but one of the things that he accomplished was that he co-organized with me a big conference in 2014 on routes and roads in Turkey, so which was quite a big conference, so not something that one organizes in a couple of weeks. At present, he is involved in or leads 3 research projects. Since 2017, he is he was very much involved in setting up Bilecik University's experimental archaeology center, and he's still going to Bilecik to work with them on expanding this center. Since 2016, he is co-directing, together with Christopher Bachhuber, the Konya Regional Archaeological Survey Project, which is also co-sponsored by the British Institute at Ankara, together with the Wainwright Fund and the Libyan Studies Foundation. And since 2016, he is also working with his colleagues from Bilecik on From Mines to Graves, Metallurgy and Metal Exchange in Western Anatolia, between 3700 and 1500 BC, and I think you can already see that we get closer to the title of the lecture. So many of the results that they already generated with both CRASP, so the Konya Plain Survey, and the project on From Mines to Graves, many of those results are already either published or in publications, and many more are coming. So, but I think, inshallah, I think that we are all curious to hear about metals that make the world go round. So I would like to invite Michele to start his lecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction, and thanks Leo for organizing the lecture. And actually, I would like to thank all the people in the BIA
for bearing with you.
No, because this is my second home, and
thank you.
I've been very happy here all these years. And where is the phone? Here is it. So, my talk this evening is going to focus on the early stages of metal manufacture and exchange in western Anatolia between roughly 3500 and 1200 BC. I will in particular attempt reconstructing the metallurgical chain operatoire, that is, the whole sequence of stages involved in the extraction, refinement, production and circulation of metal in the region. This will in turn provide an arena to discuss issues of craft specialization and labor organization during the Anatolian Bronze Ages, trying to tie this into the wider social structure of prehistoric and early historic societies of the region. I will first briefly discuss the importance of metal for the Bronze Age societies, and then I will outline the early steps of metallurgy in Anatolia. I will then discuss the evidence for the thriving mining industry in prehistoric and early historic Anatolia, and the evidence for metal manufacture as well. And finally, I will discuss how metal exchanges may have been organized and some of the possible motives behind the expansion of the interregional networks of the Bronze Ages. The analysis presented here, as Luther has mentioned as well, are part of the From Mine to Graves project in collaboration with Seppi Lehner from Sydney University and Erkan Fidan from Bilecik University, and sponsored generously by the BIAA. Before starting, for the non-specialists, I would like to just provide some basic background regarding the chronology, and you can see here we will start roughly around 3700 and around 1200 BC, between the late Chalcolithic and the end of the Hittite Empire. And this is what I mean by Western Anatolian during the Bronze Age, essentially from the eastern Aegean seaboard to the beginning, to the western fringes of the central Anatolian plateau. So, as I wanted to introduce the topic of metallurgy, I would like to mention why were metals so important to Bronze Age societies in the Near East. As a first point, early metallurgical activities were often surrounded by an aura of magic, which is understandable to anybody seeing metal melting into the fire. There is substantial evidence for metal ovens, for example, being associated with ritual pits, with burials of animals and human fetuses. As you can see here, metals and metal casting are often mentioned in Mesopotamian and Hittite sorcery texts. In Roman times, curses were written on lead sheets and hammered to the door of the person to be cursed. Still today, as you all know, in Anatolia, Kuşun dökmek is a purification ritual centered around lead casting into the water. In addition, the early use of metals, essentially as ornaments, testifies to the fascination for the shiny appearance. And since at least 4500 BC, gold in particular is a widespread symbol of leadership and divinity. More prosaically, the shapes of prehistoric artifacts were mostly constrained by the shape of the raw materials employed in the production. As for instance, in the example here, so bone tools were constrained by the shape of the bones that were being used, and stone tools by the shape of the stones, etc. Metal instead, once molten and cast, could take whatever shape was desired. And during the Bronze Ages, this versatility led to an incredible expansion in the shapes and functions of tools, weapons, personal ornaments that were simply not possible with other raw materials. Furthermore, metals, unlike any other raw materials employed in prehistory, is entirely recyclable, and once broken or useless, it can be easily recast into another shape, providing a significant advantage over other raw materials. Moreover, copper resistance to breakage, its flexibility, and its enduring sharpness made it a perfect medium for prehistoric tool and weapon manufacture. Conversely, silver and gold ductility and malleability allowed for the creation of endless ornament shapes. Due to the difficulty to be extracted and refined, metals were, by weight, among the most precious materials available in the prehistoric Near East. Before the advent of metallurgy, wealth could only be accumulated in the form of livestock or agricultural produce. Both this form of wealth necessitated large spaces to be contained. Large spaces to be contained and placed under control, and both are subject to disease and pests. On the other side, metals occupy much less space and are much more durable. As an example, in Babylon, in the first millennium BC, 1 ton of silver would buy you 10,000 tons of wheat. This allowed the accumulation of wealth at scales unimaginable before, and contributed to the creation and maintenance of social and economic inequality typical of the Bronze Age societies. Given its high value and low bulk, silver in particular started to be used as a proto-currency already during the 3rd millennium BC Mesopotamia and a few centuries later in central Anatolia. This meant that most goods could be exchanged for specific quantities of silver. You can see here. 11 grams is a shekel, which is the main unit of measure for silver in Mesopotamian Bronze Ages. More interestingly, these equivalencies were fluctuating wildly according to the demand of specific goods, the distance between the location of the exchange and the source of the products, and the season in which the exchange was taking place. And this mechanism is one of the main arguments employed to prove the existence of a market economy system already 4,500 years ago. Moving closer to this evening's topic, I would like to briefly sketch what we know so far about the early steps in Anatolian metallurgy. And with our current knowledge, Anatolia is one of the regions worldwide with the longest history of experimentation with metals. The first known objects date around 8000 BC and were made by heating and hammering nuggets of pure copper. With very few exceptions, they were very simple, as you can see here. Beads, awls, and the like. These artifacts are clustered around the Antitaurus and Zagros mountains, and around the major known deposits of pure or native copper. And this suggests that probably this is their region of origin. However, even at these early stages, we can appreciate how they were exchanged over relatively large distances. Across more than 2,500 years, we really see very little development in shapes and functions of these metal artifacts. And because of the limitations that the technology provided, I mean, they could only be hammered into shape. And copper was in all likelihood regarded like other semi-precious materials used for personal ornaments. What is interesting to note is even around 5500 BC, silver started to be experimented with, native silver, so silver nuggets. And we have some small hammer beads from Domus Tepe as well. And a major metallurgical innovation occurred around 5000 BC, when advancement in fire technology allowed building ovens that could reach around 1100 degrees, the melting temperature for pure copper. This meant that metal could now assume many different forms, opening up a new world of possibilities and much wider availability and much wider range of shapes. With melting also came the possibility of smelting, that is, a process that through liquefaction separates the metallic component of minerals from their surrounding rock matrix, which is called slag. And this is here. Smelting thus opened the possibility to exploit the deposit of metal-bearing minerals such as oxides and sulfides, which were much more common than native metals. And you can see here on top the native metal nuggets, and here the minerals, which contain in some proportion these ones, but they are embedded into the matrix and with other minerals and with other metallic elements. And also, while native metals could be collected in placer deposits along riverbanks, metal-bearing minerals needed to be mined, leading to the development of mining technology. And prehistoric mining, as you can see here, entailed digging very narrow tunnels that followed the richest mineral veins within the rock matrix. A job that was done with relatively primitive tools like horn picks, stone mauls, wooden shovels, and reed baskets and oil lamps. And in many cases we have evidence that fire setting was also employed to weaken and crack the rock. And therefore complex ventilation systems were also needed to feed the fires, because fire needs oxygen, and then oxygen is exhausted very soon. So what they were doing is they were creating small niches into the rock, and then as they were going further into the mountain, they create, this is the extraction tunnel, and they were creating a ventilation tunnel underneath to keep feeding the fire. And extracted mineral was subsequently powdered and washed to select only the most metal-rich pieces, which were ultimately smelted in a metallurgical furnace. Given the high consumption of fuel involved in smelting, this stage normally occurs in the proximity of wooded areas. Overall, it is clear that even the most basic mining operation necessitated a suite of complex skills and technologies to operate, indicating that metallurgical activities must have been supported by a high degree of craft specialization. Currently, the first evidence for mining in the nearest comes from Kozlo in northern Anatolia, where radiocarbon sample put early exploitation at around 4,700–4,500 BC. In western Anatolia, despite the abundance of non-preclassical mines, at present there is no direct evidence for the beginning of metal extraction in the region. The earliest indirect evidence comes from Baklatepe's metallurgical workshop that yields significant amounts of copper and silver slag and are datable to around 3,500 BC. So over 1,000 years later than in central Anatolia. This chronological gap between the beginning of extractive metallurgy in central and western Anatolia might to some extent be a bias of insufficient research. It however matches with trends in the western Aegean, where the first evidence for mining in Attica and the Cyclades is contemporary with, or perhaps a bit later than, Baklatepe. We are thus probably witnessing an episode of knowledge transfer from east to west, a process that involved a cluster of technologies related to extractive metallurgy, including, for instance, metal prospection, mining-related techniques, and smelting. Given that many Anatolian mines have a long history of exploitation, often continuing into the present, in most cases we cannot assess the production scale of the earliest workings. However, the mining complexes of Deir Kutun and Kestel in central Anatolia, both occupied only during the 3rd millennium BC, provide ample evidence for the large-scale extraction and refinement of copper and tin, respectively. Kestel, in particular, with a total of 1.5 kilometers of mining tunnels, 50 hectares of working station to reduce mineral ore into powder, and a 10-hectare settlement mostly dedicated to tin smelting, indicates the contemporary presence of hundreds of miners employed in different stages of tin refinement. A circuit wall surrounding the top of the village and a small public building suggest the presence of an authority coordinating this metallurgical enterprise. All these elements suggest that Kestel may have been a major producer of tin for central and western Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia, with high levels of labor organization and on a scale previously unseen. At present, no comparable mining complexes are known for pre-classical western Anatolia. Our own fieldwork in Kütahya, in collaboration with the Kütahya Species Survey Director Erkan Fidan, has in fact started revealing a rather different organization system in the region. Here, excavation and survey data indicate the existence of a Bronze Age mining district, witnessed for instance by the widespread occurrence of copper slags associated with early and middle Bronze Age sites. And you can see here, these are the metal deposits in orange, and the stars are all the slugs that we have found this year. These slugs often occur up to 10 kilometers away from known copper sources, suggesting that mineral ore may have been transported up to the individual settlements in raw form, rather than being processed near to the mine. Given that the non-copper sources are in the highlands, where also forests were likely located, smelting copper in the lowlands, as we are witnessing here, does not look like an economically effective solution. And at present, we believe it might represent less centralized, smaller scale mining activities where individual communities may have tapped into the same deposits without a tight control over the resources themselves. Similar patterns are, for instance, visible in the mining district around Baklatepe on the eastern Aegean coast, as well in the Cyclades. In both cases, mineral ore was also transported relatively far from the sources. And in the next season's fieldwork, we will try to explore this issue further. A further interesting component of the Kütahya metallurgical district is the mining complex of Gümüşköy Aktepe, currently the largest silver manufacturer in Turkey, with over 60% of last year's total product. Unfortunately, the last 30 years of mining activity destroyed most of the evidence for pre-modern exploitation. But nonetheless, our survey has managed to complement the research of the META and Heidelberg archaeological teams from the 1980s. There is now overwhelming evidence that these mines have been almost continuously exploited since the early Bronze Age, and saw an intense phase of use, particularly in the first millennium AD. Several narrow tunnels, of which you can see one sketch here, have been intercepted by modern activity and yielded coins and pottery from different periods, as well as tools related to digging and metal assaying. In particular, several radiocarbon dates from these tunnels classed between 2500 and 1700 BC. While the scale of exploitation during these early periods is at present unknown, it is possible that Gümüşköy may have been associated with Purushatum, the major trade center of silver mentioned in the Kültepe archives, whose location is still unknown, but probably lying somewhere in the Afyon region at the western end of the old Assyrian trade circuit. To better understand this, we have launched a program of lead isotope analysis on silver ores and slag from Gümüşköy to compare them with signature from known silver artifacts from Anatolia. Hopefully by next year we will be able to have a better understanding of the importance of Gümüşköy as a silver provider in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. Turning now to the evidence for metal manufacture in the Bronze Ages. With advancement in fire controlling technology, metallurgists were eventually able to melt copper and pour or cast copper metal into molds that could produce a much wider range of artifact shapes. Direct archaeological evidence for casting comes from both the metallographic analysis of the objects themselves or from the retrieval of tools employed in the process, like metallurgical furnaces, crucible, tuyères, and molds. And you can see here, for example, a sketch of a Bronze Age metallurgical furnace, which is partly underground, fed by several bellows here, and you see here the ceramic bellow nozzles that were protecting the reeds from burning, and here you see an Egyptian fresco that exemplifies very well how they were using these. And these are belonging to the second stage of casting, which is actually pouring the molten metal into the molds themselves. So these are the crucibles to pour the metal, and these are the tools to create shapes with the molten metal. As mentioned earlier, the first metal objects made of pure copper nuggets, shaped by hammering and heating, were made in the upper Euphrates around 8000 BC, and became relatively common in northern Mesopotamia and central Anatolia around 6500 BC. However, the earliest cast metal object date around 5000 BC, Yumuktepe here, and were probably made somewhere in the eastern Taurus Mountains. In western Anatolia, there is currently no attestation for cast metal objects before 4000 BC. And the earliest metallurgical workshops in western Anatolia are datable around 3500 BC, Baklatepe here and Orman Fidanlı there. In this period, silver extractive metallurgy also makes its first steps. The first the silver slags and furnaces from Fatma Kalecik on the upper Euphrates are datable around 4000 BC, and you can see here several other centers in the later 4th millennium. And in Western Anatolia, at present the evidence is later, with Baklatepe silver slags dated around 3500 BC. But while for copper and silver metallurgical technology we can see in general a diffusion of innovation from the Anti-Taurus to Western Anatolia, gold manufacture might show a different pattern. At present, by far the earliest gold artifacts in the Old World come from the rich necropolis of Varna in Bulgaria, datable around 4700-4500 BC. Here, collectively, more than 6 kilos of gold ornaments were found. And while some gold, possibly of Egyptian origin, was found in almost contemporary context in Mesopotamia, no gold implement is known in central Western Anatolia until the early 3rd millennium BC at Limantepe and later Alajuri. It is possible that the Limantepe gold band and the later and much more lavish find from Alajuri, Troy, Eskiyapar and Horostepe, among others, may have been heavily influenced by Balkan metallurgy rather than, or in addition to, Anti-Taurus metallurgical traditions. Once extractive and custom metallurgy start to take hold in Western Anatolia after about 3500 BC, we start seeing a flourish of intra-settlement metal workshops, like those you can see here. Evidence from better preserved contexts like Poliokni, Ternili, Maltepe, Baklatepe and Çukurçi on the eastern Aegean coast all suggest similar trends. For instance, we see the continuation of metallurgical activity in the same building across several centuries. Also, metallurgical activity is always conducted together with other daily chores, like food preparation, textile industry, tool making, etc. And third, metallurgical activity seems to cluster in specific neighborhoods, a bit like modern Bakırcı mahalleler in the southeast. This pattern suggests that already during the early Bronze Age, the metallurgical profession could be inherited from parent to child, with related transmission of technical and technological know-how. It also shows that metallurgists had significant level of specialization, but possibly in many cases not a full-time dedication to the craft. It also shows that, at least in specific locations closest to the metal sources, parts of the village population may have dedicated significant proportion of their time to metallurgy. In the Kütahya-Eskişehir metallurgical district, our project offers similar results. Here, virtually all excavated Bronze Age settlements have some evidence for in situ metallurgical activity. As on the Aegean coast, none of the excavated examples indicates large-scale production or full-time specialization, but rather a diffuse metallurgy, where most medium-sized sites seem to have hosted a metal smith. And so you can see here, as before, these are the metal-rich areas. The red dots are the slags that we found, which are very close to the metal deposits. And in an arc of around 150 kilometers, we see intra-site metal workshops. In most cases, the products manufactured by such artisans tend to be relatively simple, as you can see here. While the range of shapes certainly increased between the mid-4th and the late 2nd millennia, the bulk of all retrieved artifacts is represented by small tools, pins, and other simple ornaments. Only in a few instances we have more complex weapons, like massive axes or mace heads and the like. There is, however, an important group of artifacts that stands out from the rest, both because they are very complex manufacture and the precious metal they were made of. In particular, the silver and gold ornaments, vessels and weapons from the Alajuri and Horostepe elite graves, as well as hoard deposits from Troy, Poliokne and Eskiyapar, are among the most sophisticated metallurgical products anywhere in the world at the time. Indirectly, they witnessed the existence of a small number of professional, highly skilled craft people already around 2800, 2500 BC. These people were not only able to employ cutting-edge metallurgical technology of their time, they were also shaping unique works of art. The fact that some of these products contain up to 2 kilos of silver and half kilo of gold further suggests that these artisans were working on commission for the local elites, probably in workshops attached to palaces. Direct evidence for such specialized workshops come instead from the later lower town of Kültepe-Kanes on the left, one of the most important trade centers in the early second millennium. And here you can see that all these workshops are actually clustered outside the monumental area. What is intriguingly is that a few centuries later, state-sponsored metallurgists are evident in Atusha, the Hittite capital, where workshops are directly associated, for example, with the Templar area here, and certainly represent the apogee of metallurgical complexity in Anatolia during the Bronze Ages. Let's now turn the attention to the development of metallurgical technology in the region. Starting around 4000 BC, the diffusion of mining and casting technology paved the way for intensive experimentation related to both admixing of different metals together, a process called alloying, and to a suite of varied manufacturing techniques. With regard to production techniques, while there is some experimentation already in the 5th and 4th millennia BC, it is during the early Bronze Age that most of them come to light or start to be employed more commonly. And intriguingly, most of these techniques are actually still employed today by traditional jewelers. One of the earliest forms of specialized production is a so-called lost wax, example of which you can see here. A technique that was employed to create full-bodied, complex, three-dimensional artifacts, and it is first documented in Bulgaria in the early 5th millennium BC. During the 3rd millennium, probably in the context of highly specialized workshops attached to elite structures, we see a lot of experimentation with techniques such as open work, which is essentially cutting through a metal sheet, filigree, which is making small wire out of metal, granulation, which is combining together and soldering very small frills of metal, and inlay, which is encasing a metal into another metal, as in the, for example, silver employed on this standard here. While some of these techniques are probably invented in the Balkans or in Iran, some may have been a central Anatolian innovation, since the Halajuk metalwork in particular is among the most refined of its time. Intriguingly, these techniques appear for the first time almost contemporarily across a very large area, suggesting their quick spread and adoption. Their common occurrence between the Balkans and the Iranian plateau speak for the existence of a complex network of specialized metalsmiths that shared and transmitted their knowledge across. With regard to alloying, the first admixtures were probably accidental, given that most of Anatolian mineral deposits contain different metals within the same vein. Collection and smelting of different minerals together would have resulted in the first alloys, which in some cases provided clear mechanical advantages over simple copper, and or produced different aesthetic effects. In time, such combinations would have been intentionally sought after. And in order to understand the development of alloy techniques through time, our project has carried out a chemical composition analysis of over 500 Bronze Age metal artifacts from Western Anatolia, with portable XRF. These samples can now be added to the already existing dataset of analysis for the region, a total of 350 pieces, in trying to sketch broad patterns of alloy through time. Our results, based on over 850 samples from 31 sites, indicated actually for most of the Bronze Ages the majority of copper was not alloyed intentionally with other metals, but employed on its own. The first intentional alloy in Western Anatolia was arsenical copper, already attested in the earliest metal assemblages from the mid-4th millennium. Very common in the late Chalcolithic, it becomes gradually less important as it is substituted by tin bronzes and almost disappear in the late Hittite period, as you can see here in green. After tin bronzes make the first appearance around 3000 BC, they gradually become an important component of the metal assemblages by the late 3rd millennium BC. Rather surprisingly though, there is an apparent severe reduction of tin availability in Western Anatolia during the so-called Assyrian trade network period in the early 2nd millennium BC. So this is the early 2nd millennium histogram, and you can see there is not only a contraction of tin, but also a contraction of arsenical copper, as if maybe they were tapping into local sources rather than outside sources. Even though for this phase we have extensive textual records of Assyrian merchants importing Iranian tin into central Anatolia in very large quantities, very little of it seems to have reached further west. It is only during the Hittite Empire period that tin bronzes become the dominant copper-based alloy in the region. Lastly, and this is what from the early 3rd millennium onward, we start seeing a much wider range of alloy experimentation with lead, silver, and zinc being added to the copper. In the later 3rd millennium, antimony makes its appearance, while the earliest nickel copper alloys in the West occur in the late 2nd millennium BC. And all of these strange alloys, which always make a very small proportion of the total assemblages, are probably evidence for experimentation of local smiths with different products, with different minerals. Now, to what extent these different metal alloys are actually produced locally, and which ones are imported from other areas, or more broadly, how widely were metal exchanged, either in raw form or as finished products? To answer this question, one can first look at artifact typology, with the idea that specific object shapes are characteristic of one region, and if they are found somewhere else, they may have been exchanged rather than locally produced there. Basic distribution maps can, like the one here, can give an idea of this. So in this case, you can see 3 different artifact types. They're all confined within Western Anatolia, and these ones, for example, they are both in northern Mesopotamia and central Anatolia, possibly other indicating direct exchange or at least borrowing of ideas regarding shapes. And this one, for example, there are 2 different types of spear, one which is distributed in the Taurus and Anti-Taurus mountains, and the other in northern Anatolia and northern Aegean. We may not be able to pinpoint, in most cases, the precise origin of these objects, but we can glimpse at the extent of exchange networks for relatively simple daily life products. Already in the 3rd millennium, metal exchange networks are much larger than those for comparable tools and weapons made of stone, suggesting its rising importance in the life of the prehistoric Anatolian communities. Another method to investigate exchanges is to trace the spatial distribution of metals whose origin is known. A good case is that of nickel and antimony, which are rarely found in Chalcolithic and Bronze Age copper-based objects. Their only known sources are in the Eastern Taurus and Anti-Taurus mountains, respectively, which suggests that probably in alloyed form, these metals would have been exchanged up to 700 kilometers away. While it might seem a trivial distance today, it would have taken between 3 and 4 weeks of travel to cover the distance with a donkey or on foot. The third method involves lead isotope analysis, that is to some extent able to discern between a different geochemical signature of different copper, lead or silver sources, and thus provide at least a tentative answer to the question of the raw material origin. While not perfect, this method clearly shows a trend toward an increase in the range of metal sources employed between the late Chalcolithic and the end of the Early Bronze Age. Second, it also highlights how some centers, well connected with the long-distance exchange networks, received metals from a wide variety of sources, while others only tapped into the locally available and probably lower quality metals. In general, sites along the coast and along the Büyük-Menderes Valley tend to have more variety of metals, of metal sources, while those in the highlands tend to rely on a single source. Third, at sites like Polyokni and Troy, some of the copper and silver may have reached the sites from over 1,000 kilometers away from the eastern Black Sea coast. Taken all together, this evidence suggests that metal exchange networks were very large and extended both overland and through sea routes. At least since the late 4th millennium, the complexity of these networks also hints at the existence of professional traders that would have traveled for months on end to exchange metal commodities. The first strands of evidence for their existence is that between the 4th and the 3rd millennia, the volume and variety of commodities exchanged across the Near East dramatically increased. And metal do, of course, get the lion's share of all transactions. Secondly, a number of innovations in transport technology made the transfer of goods much easier. They did, however, come at the cost of increased investment, which required sponsorship from elite and or an increase in specialization of the travelers. And another strong piece of evidence is offered by the so-called balanced stone weights, whose appearance in the late 4th millennium marked the first use of standardized systems of weight across a large area. And you can see here the Svendenot weights are in red, how they are distributed, and the spool weights in black, and how they are distributed essentially through maritime connection. Their production would have required specialists, and their use would have required significant mathematical knowledge. So it is likely that they were part of the Bronze Age traders' toolkits. Invented in Mesopotamia, their diffusion in Anatolia is always tightly associated with metallurgical activity. Their small size, normally around 5 to 30 grams and rarely more than 100 grams, suggests that they may have been used to weigh precious substances like silver or gold. In fact, the first appearance of these objects in western and central Anatolia coincides with the earliest evidence for Anatolian metal in northern Mesopotamia, here, and marks the opening of the Anatolian peninsula to the long-distance Near East exchange networks. It is very likely that the major drive for the intensification of contact between the two regions was the desire of Mesopotamian agents to tap into the vast metal resources of Anatolia. What we know from written source found at Ebla, Küttepe, Mari and Hattush among others is that metal was a fundamental component of the palatial economy of the Near Eastern Bronze Age. Since the early 3rd millennium BC, copper and then silver started to be employed in a large range of transactions that employed a system of equivalencies, for example, exchanging certain amount of copper in exchange for bread, livestock, houses and land. Gold and silver in particular were customarily employed to pay armies, contractors, bureaucrats and public works. They thus worked as a form of proto-currency before coinage was invented. one of the most intriguing aspects of these systems of equivalencies is that prices fluctuated greatly based on the demand and the offer at different times of the year and in different places. And we know, for example, from QTP archives, that traders were specifically exploiting this mechanism to sell their merchandise in places where it would be more expensive. And for example, you can see here how copper would have been much cheaper in Durhumit and Tishmurna, which are known centers in the old Assyrian period, center of production of copper, than in Kanesh, which was relatively far away, like 200-300 kilometers away. So Assyrian merchants, they often were going directly to the sources to buy copper rather than buying in Kanesh. And this discovery has led some philologists in particular to question whether the beginning of market economy as we know it today has its roots already in the mid-3rd millennium BC. A last point to make is that by this time, large quantities of metal were circulating in the Near East at any given time. The extraordinary preservation of the palace archive at Ebla, a major trading center in western Syria, allows tracing the arrival of about 30,000 kilos of silver and 3,000 kilos of gold to the palace coffers in the space of one single generation, sometime around 2400 BC. The city, as you can see here, these are major routes that I reconstructed, and these are different known Syrian kingdoms of the time. Ebla was controlling several major routes that connected northern Levant with central Anatolia. And it is very likely that a consistent proportion of this gold and silver would have come from the Anatolian sources further to the northwest. Now, to conclude and bring all this to a rest, I think that what I tried to make the point very much is that Western Anatolian metallurgy is derivative in the sense that it is a place where innovations arrived rather than experimented upon. This might not be the case for Central Anatolia, especially for Çorum and for the Taurus, Anti-Taurus region, but clearly it is the case for Western Anatolia and the Aegean as well. And the Balkans are quite surprising because it's difficult to connect Balkan metallurgy with the Near Eastern metallurgy because exactly of this gap. And possibly there is a circumpontic going through the northern Pontic and the Caucasus and connecting Balkans and upper Mesopotamia through the northern route rather than through Anatolia. Now also what I try to show is that since at least the late Chalcolithic and certainly during the early Bronze Age, metallurgy becomes a very, very complex craft, both because of the infrastructure that was needed to extract metal, which was not, for example, needed for obsidian or for other ground stone or cheap stone, and also because of the scale of production that we see, at least in some places, not in all places, but at least in Derekutu and in Kestel. And again, the inheritance of the job, the fact that a lot of quite complex techniques were used at times, means that metallurgists were specialists, maybe not full-time specialists at all times, but they were certainly very high-skilled artisans. Maybe we can also call them artists because they were creating unique pieces in many cases. And metallurgy, much more than any other craft in the prehistoric and early historic Near East, attracted very high levels of experimentations, which you don't see with lithics, you don't see with mühürcülük, you don't see really with anything but with metal. Maybe I mean very high-end elite productions do see similar, but metallurgy is very peculiar in this. And also metal, because of their employment in all sorts of artifacts, in tools, in weapons, in ornaments, had a fundamental impact on the economies of the local communities in Anatolia, but also on the palatial economies of Mesopotamia, Levant, and later Central Anatolia. And I think also metallurgy, in the way that organized labor and required some coordination, certainly in Anatolia acted as a catalyst for social change. So we actually see that the rise of the elites in Anatolia is very much connected with the increase of evidence for metal exploitation. And that's it, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Michele. I think that this wonderful overview will probably has generated quite a few questions. Now, you can ask questions in English, in Italian, and also in Turkish. So it's up to you. So, any questions? German is also possible.
No, sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, Michele, for this very inspiring conference. I keep my promise and ask questions. But, well, a few things that always keeps me entertained and busy at the same time. So we have this inception of metallurgy, of extractive metallurgy, of smelting technology, and there's Yumuktepe, famous example, 5,000, 4,800 BC, yeah. And then there's this big void. There's not very much happening. And then there's this kind of second coming of metallurgy, the later 4th millennium BC. So what happens in between is still a bit of a kind of mystery, whatever. Yeah, this is, well, I personally started relating quite a few things to the Balkans and the impact that eventually triggers off a new wave of consumption and exploitation, not only exploitation but also consumption and alloying techniques and whatever, casting techniques that lead to this splendid scene that we have then in the later 3rd millennium. Just a brief personal question, you also put Atatürk
Early.
the end of third, what?
Early.
Early?
Yes.
You put it early?
Yes.
Why?
Well, first because there are radiocarbon dates. And
Yeah, but this dates from the new dates. You talk about inside
yeah,
dates.
introduction.
It's 5.
There is 5,
And
yes, still.
From material.
Inside the graves.
Yeah, but this was stored for ages in the vaults.
Yes, I mean my second evidence, strand of evidence, is the Mircuyuk. So you have very clear parallels between the Mircuyuk and Alacuyuk in several metal types, particularly the mace heads.
The mushroom
yes.
pommel mace heads.
Yes.
But the Mircuyuk is okay. This was 2,650 something.
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
exactly. I mean, 2007 is very well radiocarbon dated, the Mircuyuk. So you know that the symmetry is 2,700, 2,500.
Yeah.
So
pottery is again rather late, but I think this is still.
I mean, nobody knows what the pottery looks
but it's
like.
parallel from the Mircuyuk, pointing to this particular example. It's jugs.
Yes, I mean,
which are really.
Yes, I don't think that there is very good parallels between the two in terms of pottery. But again, nobody knows about Central Anatolian regional sequences for this period. And to answer your question, is also we don't know anything about the Chalcolithic in the Central Plateau.
That's very
so true. I'm pretty certain that Alacuyuk has a precedent, because it's not possible that they just appear to be from the void. There must be a process towards that level of specialization, and I think that we just need to excavate. And the same goes for the Black Sea coast. Nobody knows anything. I mean, people start still place Kistepe at the end of the 3rd millennium.
Oh, yes.
So
this is not bad.
So we have plenty of problems. Yes.
Even earlier.
I think that is in large part a question of not having investigated enough, not having excavated context to compare.
May I?
Last
Last,
question for you.
okay. Very briefly, I like this chart with the different alloying types and stuff. This tin-based alloy and the other alloys you refer to. Do you think these are necessarily intentional alloys? But there's, I believe, also lots of recycling where you
I
have
cut a couple of slides about that.
Yeah.
So there are there is definitely evidence for recycling, and that evidence for recycling peaks during the old Assyrian trade period. So you have not only less tin coming in, not only less arsenical copper being produced, you also have more recycled artifacts, probably from previous periods. They are remelting. And what is the evidence for recycling is this very dirty alloys.
That's so good.
Quaternary alloys and stuff that 2% of tin, 1.5% of arsenic, 3% of lead.
Exactly.
Yes. However, there is a pattern in tin and lead being co-alloyed together, and I think it's intentional, and you see it everywhere.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much, first of all, for this marvelous speech. It's really wonderful, and I learned a lot of things from it. Well, my question is about trade or exchange routes between Western Anatolia and Central Anatolia, and maybe Aegean too. We can put Aegean Cycladic Islands. Well, I wonder if there is any relationships between obsidian or any similarities between obsidian and metal trade during the early Bronze Age.
Yes, I think so.
Because I know that you
Yes.
also look for the obsidian routes too.
Yes, yes, definitely there is. I mean, the major routes, they go through major natural corridors, of which the Büyük-Menderes is the main corridor connecting the Aegean with Central Anatolia.
And also Hermos Valley too.
Hermos a little bit less, because the Hermos doesn't go all the way to the Central Plateau. The Büyük-Menderes is, we know less about the Hermos Valley, so I can say less. We have many more excavated stuff in the Büyük-Menderes. But the Büyük-Menderes is certainly, you can see from all sorts of different artifact types, all sorts of burial customs, architecture. It is a very big corridor, so where things are exchanged, where ideas circulate, and so metal goes through, obsidian goes through, and what of course you see in Bakla Tepe and Liman Tepe, that there is more Central Anatolia obsidian coming to the Aegean in the later third millennium. You see it also with metal. So in Troy, in Poliokni, in Terni, you see an influx of strange, sources of metal that were not there before, and they suddenly appear. Not the suddenly, but there is a gradual increase of contacts between West and Central Anatolia in the mid-third millennium.
So is there any relationships between the Cycladic Islands and Central Anatolia or Western Anatolia for
Yes, yes. For example, tin bronzes, which in my opinion come in this period, for this part of the world, they come from Kestel and they come from Isakci, they come from Kayseri and Nide. In small quantities they are found in the Cyclades at the same time as Central Anatolian obsidian is found. So they come together. Probably at this point obsidian is not very precious, so it is piggybacking on the metal rather than vice versa.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Metals make the world go round. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you for your valuable contributions. We know the natural roads are an important factor in regional connections during this period in Western Anatolia. One of these is the plain of Büyük-Menderes, as you mean. I wonder whether you can create main routes between region, Eastern Mediterranean, Anatolian and in Aegean world, according to proportions of the elements in metal finds.
Yes.
As you know, especially pottery tradition, lithics and marble finds shed light on cultural interaction, cultural reflection in Bronze Age, especially. Is it possible?
It is. It is actually. I had a large chunk of this presentation cut, and the answer was there. Yes. With our project, we are collecting 1,800 samples from both West and Central Anatolia and the Aegean and Upper Mesopotamia to try to see this in specific. And you can clearly see the Büyük Menderes has much more tin than in the inland Western Anatolian highlands like Afyon and Kütahya. There is very little tin there until the late 2nd millennium BC, but there is a lot of tin coming down to the coast already in the early 3rd millennium, mid 3rd millennium. So the Büyük Menderes is funneling tin as well. And so this is one route. In the late Bronze Age, as also Uluburun and Cape Gelidonia they show, there is the Iranian tin coming through the Levant and through the southern coast to the eastern Aegean coast. And I think that Çin Tepecik's very high tin levels is because of Uluburun sort of maritime networks rather than Central Anatolia. Because at the same time as Çin Tepecik bronzes, we have nothing in Bece Sultan. Bece Sultan stubbornly from the late Chalcolithic to the late Bronze Age only arsenical copper.
Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, I understood you correctly. You mentioned something along the lines of, especially in the Kütahya region, the sites of resources are somewhat, or this processing sites are somewhat removed from the actual resource sites.
Yes.
And you mentioned that most probably the control of the resources was not very tight. Can you say something along the lines of this, whether this continues throughout the Bronze Age, or is there some sort of with the growth of economy and trade, control of resources also changes in time?
Yes. Okay. So, for example, in the 3rd millennium, in places like Konya, the Bece Sultan Plain, you start already having fortification, regional fortification. So you have forts controlling access to valleys or forts of major rivers. So by the 2nd millennium in the Konya Plain you have a real sort of gözletme külelerin savunma sistemi. Why did I say it?
Oh, mashallah, mashallah.
What we were struggling to find in Kütahya is these fortifications, and we found a lot of fortifications, all from the late Iron Age or later. So there is no sense of larger political structures in Kütahya until the late Iron Age or Hellenistic period. So that's also where my idea of loose control comes from.
Okay, I think it would be a good idea to continue the discussion with a glass of wine. Thank you very much, Michele.
Thank you.